Welcome back. The time has come to tackle the last form component for this course, the base radio. Radio buttons in HTML have a very unique feature that we need to be aware of before we start building our components. They do not work as single elements like a checkbox would. Radio buttons instead live and work in a group that share a single state. Depending on this state, radio buttons inside a group either are active or inactive in relation to those in its own group. Because of this particular quirk in how radio elements work, our base radio component will also have another component to group them, the base radio group. We will tackle that in the next lesson. We will begin the lesson by crafting our base radio component. The goal is to have a flexible, reusable component that wraps a single instance of a radio input along with its label. As before, we will first create our component file BaseRadio.view inside the Components folder. Then, copy the input label pair for one of our checkboxes from simpleform.view and paste it into the components template block. Next, we're going to first tackle the label. So let's go ahead and create our label prop. It will be of type of string and the default of an empty string. Let's now go to the template inside the label element. We will check with a BF to see if the label property has been set and use interpolation to render it. Now that the label is dynamic and bound, let's go ahead and make sure that our component can respond to vModel bindings. We will begin by creating our model value property. Notice that for the base radio, we have set the type of model value prop to be of string and number. This will tell View that this property can accept either strings or numeric values. When dealing with radio buttons, each button holds the value it represents in the set. For example, if you had a group of radio buttons to select your favorite pet, one radio button would represent dog and another would represent cat. It's common for these buttons to also represent numerical values. For example, when selecting a number of guests for a hotel room, or even Boolean values in their numeric format. Having said that, let's now try to figure out how to use the model value property in a radio element. Similarly to checkboxes, radio elements don't bind to the value property of the input, but instead to the checked property. However, in the particular case of radio elements, because they live in a group, we need to determine if this button is the one that is selected or not. Let's go back to our example to understand how. The model value of our base radio elements will contain the user's preference, so either cat, dog, or otter. In our right example, 1, 2, or 3. But we need to be able to tell this radio which one of these values it represents. In order to do this, we're going to add first a new property to the component, the value. Let's scroll down to our properties and add another one, the value. This time, the type will be also of string and number, but we're not going to set a default. Instead, we will set it to required. If this property is not set, View will issue a warning for us. A radio button does not make sense when there's not a value attached to it. And even further, if the user forgets to set it, it could end up with multiple radio buttons having the same value, which will be really problematic. So in order to know if our radio is checked, we will look to see if the model value is equal to the value. So that means that the user's preference, cat in this example, will either be equal to the radio's value or won't, checked or unchecked. Let's now go ahead and delete the old vModel binding. We will replace it with a checked binding where we check if model value is equal to the value property. Then replace the value binding with our new value property and delete the hard-coded name attribute. We're almost there. We now need to add the second part of our vModel contract, the emitting of update events. Radio buttons trigger change events when they become the selected option. So we're setting up a change event listener with our update model value emit. be sure to pay close attention to the payload of our emit. We are going to emit the value prop. We want our vModel recipient on the parent to hold the value of the currently selected radio button, and because the change event will only fire when the element makes the selected choice, we can safely fire props.value to update the parent about the newly selected option. Finally, because we removed the hard-coded name attribute, we need to make sure that the developer using this component is able to set attributes like name into our input. So we will use vbind attrs on our input like we learned when we were building our base input component to be able to allow this attribute injection into the correct element. Now that our component is ready, we can go back to our simpleForm.view and replace the two checkboxes with our shiny new BaseRadio component. Let's navigate back to SimpleForm and replace the first element. I will add a BaseRadio instance. We will vModel it to event.pets, bind the value to 1, and set up the label property to yes. Finally, let's add the name attribute equal to pets. Let's do this one more time. Add the BaseRadio instance, vModel it to event.pets, bind the value to 0, set the label property to no, and add the name attribute equal to pets so that it belongs to the same group as the one above. Let's now go over to the browser and check out if everything is working. You can see as I click around between the yes and no option that the pets binding of our form correctly changes between 1 and 0. As we've seen, radio buttons can sometimes be quirky and hard to work with, but we've made good progress into creating a solid BaseRadio component. In our next lesson, we will take this a step further and create a BaseRadio group component, which will simplify even further the creation of radio groups. See you there! So in this example, either cat, dog, or wow.